Our next speaker is Dr. A.M.A. Ghadirian. Dr. Ghadirian is Associate Professor at McGill University and an Associate Psychiatrist at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. He is also Director of the Psychopharmacology Program at the Montreal General Hospital, where he teaches medical students the role of nutrition in mental health. He is also a consultant to the Baha'i international community at the United Nations on the prevention of alcoholism and drug dependency. In 1976, Dr. Ghadirian represented the Baha'i international community at the Second World Congress on the prevention of alcoholism and drug dependency held in Mexico. He has written numerous research articles on both psychiatry and the Baha'i faith. Dr. Ghadirian will talk to us this afternoon on adaptive response to stress in family life. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Ghadirian.
Thank you, Sam. The stress in family life, I'm going to concentrate primarily on stress in life in general because of two reasons. One, my colleague already touched upon a few items which was related to stress and family breakdown. Second, there's going to be a workshop on stress and family life. So my presentation will be rather general on stress and individual life. Life stress and the wear and tear of human existence is not a novel phenomenon. In fact, the word stress was first used in the 15th century, and the terms stress, distress, and disease all are interrelated. During the past 15 years, however, social circumstances and also consciousness of stress phenomena have risen very alarmingly, particularly in the Western world. Hans Selye, the most celebrated pioneer in the field, considers stress as the spice of life, without which life is boring. And he has a very strong taste for this spice. And he defines stress as such, that stress is the non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. By demand, he means a stressful stimulus or a stressor which evokes a stress response in the organism. He believes that although stressors are of diverse qualities, they basically elicit the same biological response. Speaking on biological terms, Selye further states that from the point of view of its stress-producing or stressor activity, it is immaterial whether the agent or situation we face is pleasant or unpleasant. All that counts is the intensity of the demand for a readjustment or adaptation. Then he cites this example. The mother who is suddenly told that her only son died in battle suffers a terrible mental shock. If years later it turns out that the news was false and the son unexpectedly walks into her room alive and well, she experiences extreme joy. The specific results of the two events, sorrow and joy, are completely different, in fact, opposite to each other. Yet their stressor effect, that is to say, biological aspect of it, the non-specific demand to an entirely new situation may be the same. Selye identified two kinds of stress, eustress and distress. Eustress is the positive and essentially valuable form of stress that will contribute to the well-being of the organism. When stress becomes unpleasant or harmful, it will result in discomfort and distress. Now, other investigators define the stress in different way. For example, one of them says that stress, he defines it as a condition in which there is a marked discrepancy between the demands made on an organism and the organism's capacity to respond. When the demand is too much and the response is inadequate, then the stress experience is going to be felt. Different individuals show different sensitivity to the same stress. Therefore, what is perceived as a stress by one individual may not be the same for another. It is said that one man's stress is another man's challenge. The perception of a stressful event is not always the same for the same person at different points in time. Environment can affect a person's sensitivity to stress as much as it will influence the intensity and character of the threat itself. This brings us some understanding in what Madame Rabbani was saying this morning, that a shock of life in early age doesn't necessarily is going to cause an irreparable type of damage in future. The support, the family environment, many other elements are going to influence that shock to the person. Linford Rees, a psychiatrist, a British psychiatrist, described his interview of a patient whose main complaint was an intense anxiety feeling. As the psychiatrist began to take a very lengthy history, the patient commented, "I can tell you exactly what's the matter, and it's my work which is the cause of my trouble." The therapist replied, "Yes, tell me about it." The patient continued, "I work in a fruiter's shop." "Yes," said the therapist. "What do you actually do?" "My job is to separate the large oranges from the small oranges." "Yes," nodded the therapist. "That's it," the patient answered. "It's decisions, decisions, decisions." Psychologists may say that this man has some trouble in processing information. But the layman has a very easy answer for that, saying, "Going bananas in a fruit store." Although the concept of a stress was originally defined in terms of its biological mechanism, human response to stress or any conflict of that nature is manifold. In this paper, the stress response is discussed primarily in the context of psychosocial and spiritual reality of human life. Furthermore, the term stress is used to include a broader meaning such as suffering, which is a personal response to the stressful circumstances and deprivation. Human responses to life stress of diverse nature can be divided into 4 groups as follows. All right. Now, stress here, let's say that if we consider stress as a stimulus, the response will be in 4 types: psychological, physiological, social and cultural, and spiritual. Let's take a look at the psychological responses. The way that we perceive and define an event or crisis can have important bearing on the consequences of that event upon us. If we can make sense out of an event that we encounter and draw some objective meaning and conclusion from it, the impact of that event will be less dreadful. Meaninglessness, on the other hand, can be very disturbing. Sometimes religious truth and cultural beliefs would give society certain explanation and meaning to life events which otherwise could not readily be achieved by science and reason. An important example of this is the spiritual interpretation of Shoghi Effendi of the historical crisis that is encircling the world of humanity today. It clearly depicts the evolution of mankind in the heat of a critical ordeal at this juncture of history, and it makes sense. Although the cognitive awareness may not completely eliminate or alleviate the tension generated from a threatening event, it will reduce the anxiety of ignorance. When this awareness is confirmed by divine knowledge and celestial conviction or faith, human capacity for tolerance and acceptance of noxious attacks or threats expands. Individuals who fear the darkness, in reality, they may fear their own inability to recognize a threat possibly disguised in the darkness. Therefore, what is unknown will also become frightening. The psychological responses are coping mechanisms which, depending on their personality, physical and genetic predisposition of one individual, and the nature and intensity of the crisis, can be divided into adaptive and non-adaptive responses. Now, adaptive responses, a person facing critical threats, whether a physical or psychological nature, takes certain emergency measures to protect and defend his integrity. Some of these reactions are coordinated by instincts and neurophysiological reflexes and come into action before man has a chance to reflect upon its outcome. These are emergency responses which nature devised to protect the species facing unexpected changes. Cannon described fight and flight as part of individual responses to the threat of life. As civilization advances both in material and spiritual terms, one expects that the violent circumstances which are conducive to physical responses of a primitive nature will also be reduced. Humanity will then evolve into a higher plane of maturity and tolerance, and will acquire a greater capacity for love and acceptance than for hate and violence. In day-to-day life, however, the art of mastery over stress and coping with disturbances of life remains a challenge for every individual, whether a child or an adult. When faced with stressful life events, particularly those which will threaten the bond of an intimate relationship between two individuals, the individual's need for affection and affiliation with the social system of support will increase. Similarly, the person's sensitivity to rejection or any threat of that nature will rise. The affected individual, depending on his childhood education and personal resources, may tend to become more suggestible and show a greater compliance to the demands of the others. Now here, we see that adaptive responses could include plans for reality orientation and problem solving, or could be emotional discomfort appropriate to stress. Could be tension, could be anxiety, could be depression to some extent, or could be a rise of affective and affiliative needs, a need to be looked after, to be communicated with love and affection by group or by the community. There will be a rise of suggestibility and compliance. There also will be mechanism of defense, which I'm going to go over that later on. Sociocultural orientation and personal belief and expectations will influence the individual tolerance and ability to accept the reality of life crisis. The advent of modern technological progress has blurred man's vision of pain and suffering. Scientific advancement has raised his expectations of comfort and security in every facet of life. This has further nurtured his conception of control over himself and his environment. As this wishful thought will not always come into reality, man has become more vulnerable to stress than before. Time urgency and competitive striving for achievement constitute some of the behavioral features of the North American culture. These characteristics are implicated in the so-called type A behavioral pattern, and these individuals are predisposed to a type of coronary heart diseases. And their characteristics are as follows. These are people who have a type of excessive urges for achievement. They have very highly achievement orientation. They are very competitive. This is their lifestyle. They have a type of time urgency. They have a number of deadlines every day waiting for them to meet. They are hyper alertness. They are restlessly impatient. They are explosive in their speech. They are hard-driving worker, and this is their work style, and they are basically aggressive, especially when the deadline approaches, the aggressive behavior increases. Now, this is not universally accepted and confirmed, but most of the psychologists and psychiatrists, they believe that this is a type of behavior that we especially can find in very civilized modern countries. Individuals with type A behavior show a compulsive desire to achieve more and more in less and less time. Their behavior is not considered an indication of a psychosis or an acute psychiatric syndrome. On the contrary, it is a socially accepted and praised form of behavior. Although a very hard worker and successful, such an individual may have to pay a high price by his vulnerability to coronary heart disease, which reportedly is pretty high among them, as I said earlier. Aside from type A, there also is type B behavior pattern, which is the opposite of type A, with greater objectivity and moderation. Some of you may say that type B perhaps corresponds with Baha'i behavior. Well, that's fine. What happens is that, however, at the end of the plan, we have a tendency to go toward type A behavior, rushing, in bad mood, and all the time deadlines, no time for the children, and so this is the way that it goes until the plan is over, then falling back to type B. Some investigators are of the opinion that type A behavior pattern is basically a coping style to maintain control over life events and to be able to ward off anxiety generated by the stressful events. A relentless consciousness and wish to control self and environment comprise some of the important attributes inherent in the Western civilization. Failure to have control over living circumstances becomes a new source of stress. In view of the fact that some of the stressful life events may manifest themselves in a crisis proportion beyond human control, such as earthquake, terminal diseases, and death, the coping task of individuals with compulsion to control will be a sorry plight. In circumstances where a rigid and demanding working program is in order, the impact of a continuous struggle to maintain control over the situation may lead to serious consequences. Ruya Khanum this morning said that there are things that we should learn from the animals, and I'm going to cite an example which was published in Scientific American a few years ago, and this is as follows. In a controlled study, 2 monkeys were placed in 2 separate experimental setups. In one, the so-called executive monkey had to press a lever upon the appearance of a red light in order to avoid a shock. This avoidance task continued at a rate of 15 to 20 times per minute for 6 hours. Followed by a 6-hour rest period without any red light or shock. On the other side was the control monkey. for whom the appearance of the red light had no significance, nor did the pressing upon the lever. This monkey, after some sporadic pressing of the lever in either position, lost interest in it and gave up. While the executive monkey collapsed and died during the avoidance session after 23 days of continuous 6 hours on and 6 hours off schedule of pressing the lever. The autopsy showed a perforated duodenal ulcer. The study shows that stressful programs which are rigidly structured and demand strenuous performance can lead to physical disorder. Now, coping through control is a learned behavior, and the roots of which can be traced in the family education and technological advancement. In the authoritarian families, the children will learn how to face or diffuse a crisis by means of control extended over other people or other objects. When this control and the aggressive drive with it fails, a considerable anxiety and tension will prevail. The social source of coping through control is based on the illusion that man in this golden era of scientific progress must be able to conquer all difficulties encountered in this universe. Recently, a man from California was mowing his lawn, and when his lawnmower broke down, he tried in vain to start it. Then he kicked it, then he cursed it, and shouted at it. None of them worked. As all were to no avail, he went into his house, took his shotgun, and returned to his lawnmower and stood in front of it and shot at it 5 times. He was then arrested. And he was charged by the court for the use of a firearm within the city district. Now, one may wonder if that episode was a displacement of aggression from a person, such as mother-in-law, to a person to an object, such as lawnmower. Whatever the dynamics may be, this example shows how in a technological world an individual is unable to accept the failure, even the failure of a lawnmower. Such a failure would presumably undermine his own authority to control and achieve. Now, the other series of responses. All right. Okay, I'm sorry. The distressful responses or non-adaptive responses consist of severe anxiety or fear, grief or despair, and rage or depression. These symptoms, in a mild to moderate degree, may be seen as a part of the adaptive responses, but when the stress is extensive, the distressful signals would manifest. Now, physiological responses may appear in 2 parameters. Adaptive responses that include neurohormonal changes in response to a threat or psychophysiological disorders such as bronchial asthma, peptic ulcer, migraine, etc. There are now some indications that the brain makes natural anxiety-inducing and anxiety-reducing substances. The latter, which is an anti-anxiety substance, one of them as an example is inosine, can alleviate excess apprehension and maintain a state of calmness and serenity. And this is one of the most exciting medical achievements during the past 10 years, that they found certain natural substances in the brain which can alleviate anxiety. And at the time of stress, this substance will rise in the brain. Medicine has yet to learn the nature of this function and to know how to turn on the release of such natural substances as anxiety-reducing elements, and to avoid the use of external agents such as tranquilizers. It is possible that biofeedback and meditation have a role to play in the release of these substances. One of the exciting medical discoveries of recent years is that of endorphin. This hormone, of which several subtypes have recently been identified, is an opiate-like substance synthesized and released by the body under acupuncture. And under acupuncture, the release of this substance in the brain is increased. And also it is hypothesized that possibly during the trance state or during the excitement, let's say that ecstasy, that some of the cultural group go through in the time of their ritual experiences and exercises, the endorphin will rise in their brain, and that is the feeling of joy that they receive. Scientists are investigating the possible relationship of endorphin with increased resistance to pain and suffering or experiences of excitement. It is possible that under stress, some substances such as this hormone are released as a physiological adaptive measure for coping with the external threat. Future discoveries will probably explain the scientific and biological aspects of joy and excitement experienced by the martyrs and pioneers of science and religion who met their death or persecution with serenity and acceptance. Now, the social responses to stress. These responses may vary from culture to culture. In general, a stressful event will increase an individual's affiliation and integration into his sociocultural system, whereby he has already developed a sense of belonging and identification. The stronger the bond of love and unity within the members of a family or community, the greater will be their healing power at the time of crisis. Isolation against the will of an individual, such as imprisonment, may render that person more vulnerable, far beyond the deprivation of his right to live in freedom. One of the authors pointed out that when a soldier is alienated and removed from his unit, he loses his vital contact with his peers who otherwise could share with him the misery of war and let him know that they too are suffering. Being deprived of such essential feedback at a time when he most needs them, the soldier may begin to misinterpret his anxiety and discomfort as the symptoms of some physical or mental disease. Should he be reunited with his group, he will most likely invalidate his misinterpretation. Otherwise, he may behave as a sick person. The author points out the central importance of guidance and support that a stressed individual receives from individuals or groups important to him in his coping process. When this principle is applied to family life, one can appreciate the salient role of parental communication and guidance in the problem-solving effort of their children at a time of crisis. Now here you see the social responses adaptive, such as greater affiliation and integration into society, community support, ritual and religious type of interactions, transient alienation and isolation, or maladaptive type of responses such as violence and aggression, alcoholism and drug abuse, social discrimination and prejudices, delinquency, breakdown of family life and social integration, mass hysteria, suicide, and homicide. Now, spiritual responses to the stress. The human soul is an active and progressive facet of human reality, and thus will not remain unaffected by the consequences of our interaction with the environment. According to Abdu'l Baha, the soul, like the body, has its own individuality. The spirit, Abdu'l Baha says, is changeless, indestructible. The progress and development of the soul, the joy and the sorrow of the soul are independent of the physical body. If we are caused joy or pain by a friend, if a love prove true or false, it is the soul that is affected. If our dear ones are far from us, it is the soul that grieves, and the grief or trouble of the soul may react on the body. Abdu'l Baha elaborates on the two sentiments of joy and sorrow by which everyone is affected. He elucidates that the sorrow and grief originates from the material world and will affect the person, while the spiritual world bestows only the joy. If one suffers, it is the outcome of material things, and all the trials and troubles come from this world of illusion. Therefore, the spiritual reality of man, though may be affected by sorrow and pain of the external world, it will not be the cause of these experiences. Under the stress of diverse nature and intensity, one may recognize the following changes in relation to his spiritual reality. Greater attachment to personal faith and belief under severe stress. Higher capacity to accept pain and suffering. Consciousness of one's helplessness and imperfection, and a greater awareness to a supreme power, the Creator. Awareness of a supreme source of might and perfection. Reliance on prayer and meditation. Increased sense of purpose in life. Now, some aspects of coping with stress. Certain degrees of stress and strain are essential ingredients of life, and entirely stress-free life does not exist, at least in this planet. Moreover, a mild to moderate amount of stress will stimulate human growth and creativity. A few years ago, students of a community college were asked to participate in a study which was aimed at reduction of anxiety and discomfort related to the stress of their academic performance and exams. The students followed an intensive and systematic relaxation programs. At the end of the academic year, they were found more relaxed, but they also showed a drop in their interest and motivation for academic performance. Quite a few of them flunked out, but very, very relaxedly. They were at peace. When life stress is severe and out of proportion, the individual's coping effort may need to be supplemented by additional support or intervention provided by family or friends or society. Kaplan divides individuals' coping responses to stressful life events into 4 phases or facets. One of these facets is goal-directed behavior, which is aimed at the source of threat for reducing its intensity and providing an escape for the person involved. In order to attain this objective, the individual resorts to his problem-solving skill and cognitive capacity. To what extent he is able to succeed, however, is not entirely dependent on his plans, but also on the magnitude of the emotional distress that he is experiencing. Under stress, human attention, memory, and even value judgment are all affected, the extent of which will determine the outcome of a crisis intervention or problem-solving plan. Another facet is acquisition of skills and capabilities for dealing effectively with the stressful circumstances when they arise. This can be achieved through educational programs, for example, allowing the individuals, especially the children, to face a progressively increasing amount of stress in the presence of effective family and social support and guidance will enable them to perfect their competence and coping skills for the time of crisis. Each person possesses a number of psychological defense mechanisms which can reduce the intensity of emotional arousal and unpleasant feelings such as anxiety, grief, and despair. The following are a few of the frequently used defense mechanisms. At the time of severe stress, one of the defense mechanisms is denial. Have you seen that happen? No, I don't think so. The other one is selective attention. All of a sudden the person forgets. Selective amnesia, very, very useful technique. Another way is avoidance. Just withdraws, being away, I've never been home, so don't call. Or counter behavior, which could be fear and withdrawal, or could be aggressive and attack. In the process of adaptation, it will eventually be necessary to come to terms with the reality of stressful events such as a loss or threat. This is a process of making an internal adjustment to a difficult and often painful reality of external nature. To overcome crisis or a stressful life event, one has to assess his resourcefulness in terms of his emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and physical capabilities and assets. Family and community's availability and willingness to effectively support and guide the individual concerned is very important. In the case of grief due to a loss, for example, one may pass through some or all of the following experiences: shock, denial, despair, recognition, and then acceptance and adjustment. Naturally, the individual's perception of meaning and the reality of death as a rebirth or continuation of the soul's journey in the other world will make it easier to bypass the first or the two first stages and arrive at the level of recognition and acceptance. The supportive attitude of the family and friends will accelerate this healing process. It is not possible to discuss the broad area of stressful life events that families face in their daily life and analyze the dynamics of interaction for each event in this article. But I would like, at the end, to share with you a critical evaluation of the current stress response theory in terms of psychosocial adaptation. The present behavioral sciences contend that when the psychosocial measures of coping responses to life-threatening stressors will not succeed and the personal resources fail to meet the demands of the circumstances, a breakdown of psychosocial defenses may follow, and thus psychosis or some severe psychophysiological disorders may occur as a result. Among the diverse stressors, life-threatening events may be implicated in this kind of responses. Yet, history shows that human tolerance for suffering during a life crisis goes far beyond the psychological formulation of defenses and adaptation. What is startling is that suffering in some circumstances is not perceived as a grievous blow to human defenses, rather is welcomed with positive emotions such as joy and gratitude in the absence of any psychosis or peptic ulcer. The concluding part of this article is devoted to this strange but historically validated human response. A spiritual reality of human existence and its potent influence on the behavior does not constitute a popular chapter of the present psychological textbooks, as it is not considered, quote, scientific, unquote. If the objective of science, then, is discovering truth and its attribute, then the contemporary psychology is ignorant of a fundamental truth. Faith and belief in a religion or in a religious truth, whether it is affected by its superstition or continues in its original form of purity, comprises an integral part of the personality of each person. When such an integral part is threatened, is attacked, the result may not always follow the conventional pattern of stress response paradigm, as we already have discussed. The response may be surprisingly the opposite. It was mentioned earlier that there are a number of psychological defenses that people frequently use as a response to life stressors. However, observations show that these responses are not elicited among the early believers of various religions and great pioneers of science. An example of this is the life of martyrs as observed in the Dawnbreakers and the recent persecution in Iran. In the next slide, shows the comparison of stress responses that often are observed in society as compared to the spiritual counterparts noted by acknowledgement. I said that in general we see consciously or subconsciously we respond to the severe stress by denying, but the spiritual response at the time of persecution and crisis is not denial, is acknowledgement. At the time of crisis, we have selective amnesia, selective attention. At the heat of crisis and ordeal, there is a full reflection. At the ordinary life, there is avoidance and escape, suggested by many psychiatrists even. But at the time of crisis, it is full acceptance. At the ordinary responses to crisis is counter behavior, hate, aggression, fear, withdrawal. But at a time when we respond spiritually, it is peaceful tolerance, blissfulness. In the life of martyrs, one can recognize an extraordinary sense of joy and blissfulness at the hour of death. This observation raises some questions concerning the validity of tolerance hypothesis in the face of crisis. One explanation would be when the life threat, whether psychological or physical, can be explained and accepted in the light of a belief and conviction, whether scientific or divine, that enlightenment will arouse courage and abate fear and anxiety for whatever the consequences may be. Through spiritual affiliation and faith, one sees in death a reunion with the beloved and rebirth into a new spiritual reality long awaited for. Thus, faith gives a new meaning to suffering and can transform fear into joy. Love is an important ingredient in this process. Baha'u'llah states, O Son of Man, my calamity is my providence. Outwardly it is fire and vengeance, but inwardly it is light and mercy. Hasten thereunto, that thou mayest become an eternal light and an immortal spirit. In the Seven Valleys, Baha'u'llah underlines the significance of pain in association with love. He says, the state of this valley is pain, and if there be no pain, this journey will never end. Viktor Frankl, an existential psychologist. His words on suffering are most befitting for this conclusion. He says, suffering ceases to be suffering. In some way, at the moment, it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of sacrifice.